G'day everyone, welcome to the Talking Leadership podcast. Thank you for joining me again. And today I am speaking to someone who works in the legal world particularly around employment issues, and I cannot wait to get the podcast started. So by way of introduction, he is the principal and director of NB Lawyers. Can I welcome to the podcast, Jonathan Mamaril? How are you, mate?
Nice to be here, Eric. Thanks.
Mate, appreciate you coming along to speak. So we've decided off air and a couple of weeks back when we spoke to maybe do this as a hybrid discussion because your experience around HR from that client perspective and what it means for leadership, I think is a critical one to be talking about. And to be fair to those that may be new to this space, I think if you are new to this space, then you're missing out on something that's quite important for your business, because when we talk about leadership being about dealing with people and leadership being the great enabler, sometimes things go wrong in organizations and leaders have to be aware of what that looks like, particularly around people issues. So this is quite a timely discussion to be having. So before we get started on those questions, Jonathan, a bit of background to yourself. So why get into the legal space and why particularly in this area of law, and how you think it links in with this idea of leadership?
Yeah, this area is one that is, I wouldn't say necessarily ignored, but potentially other areas of law take more precedence, say commercial law or property law, for example, might take more precedence for organizations, most because organizations are making those transactional moves. But dealing with your people, there's probably a couple of levels. One's HR or the human resources side, and then there's the other side, which is the employment law side, which are really inextricably linked. And what we're seeing as a result of what's happened in the last couple of years through the pandemic, we're actually seeing quite a lot of issues in this space, which are really coming to fruition out of actions, inaction, business, general results of what's happened in the last couple of years. So you're starting to see a magnifying of what used to occur, but you're seeing a magnifying of quite a lot. Let's say claims, dealing with performance management. These are becoming much more prevalent. Mental illness, much more prevalent in this period of time.
Okay, that's a good foundational start to the discussion, and I might tease that out a little bit with you. You deal with a lot of organizations, you deal with a lot of businesses that are having issues around human resources, employment type issues. How has that affected, if it has affected, I won't preempt your response, obviously, your definition of what leadership is? So you've been around leaders, you're a leader yourself. Do you think the world in which you play in professionally has impacted on your definition of leadership?
I think that's a good question, Eric. And I might take it to a couple of levels. So I think the first level is management. There's definitely been an effect on management and managers. And in particular, two big issues we have currently, which is retention and recruitment. Okay, the massive problems. What we're seeing in this HR space right now is difficulties of how to manage those problems, whether it's under-resourcing, whether it's keeping people in positions that you probably wouldn't in normal times, maybe promoting people into positions where they're potentially not quite ready for, and it's manifesting in a way. It has to. It's manifesting in claims, that's job protections, unfair dismissal, discrimination claims, workplace bullying, sexual harassment, work cover claims, or it's manifesting people resigning, people going on, go slows, people who are having issues with work from home, developing mental illness or depression, anxiety, and managing that is becoming a problem. So I think going from that level to the other level, which is probably that leadership level, leading that, or leadership teams leading that, is problematic, because having those difficult conversations, having strategic difficult conversations are becoming problematic, because you're not necessarily sure what may come about because of those discussions. And so I think you have a situation where leaders understanding that people being a massive resource, and in some companies, probably the biggest resource they have, but not quite sure how to deal with those resources currently, deal with people right now in a way that doesn't create major risk or major liability, but also in a pure sense of trying to retain people or recruit people in the future for future growth. So I think you have these conflicting parts that are occurring right now, not just at that leadership level, which is, in some ways conceptual, but also I think you have it at that down to earth level, which is the management side as well.
Yeah, thank you for clearing that up. I think there's always going to be a tension there, and the issues you brought up before about seeing more mental health problems, more potential claims around issues to do with the world of work and the space in which you work in. Do you think there's a lot of, and I'll try and keep the terminology out of this as much as I can, because I want this to be a free-flowing discussion, and it's not about research so much. It's more about asking you the question, do you think leaders sit back when they've had to get you involved to resolve an issue, that there is any learnings from that experience, or is it more a reactive thing when you're talking about people in the workspace context?
It's a good question, Eric, because in some respects it will depend on the organization and how they value human resources. And I mean that in several levels: the human resources teams, functionality, and then of course the people that have in the organization and the way that works in that organization. So, human resources in manufacturing is going to be completely different to, say, human resources in, say, a professional services environment, where maybe the main revenue generators. Okay, so as opposed to product and service. So there is a difference in how they would approach it. Whether there's learnings, that really comes down to, again, the stock they put into human resources. For example, if you're not following a policy, or if your managers aren't following a policy, say workplace bullying policy or health and safety policy that's been developed by the organization, then of course you'd expect that there's going to be high risk, which is most likely going to turn to high reliability, most likely going to turn into penalties for the organization and penalties for the individuals involved, right? Or financial penalties. And of course the media that goes with that, and the publicity that goes with it, negative publicity that goes with that, right? However, you could potentially use that as a learning opportunity as to, okay, well, what could we have done for this to not occur in the first place? For example, management training around performance management. Why we want to do it in a certain way. That's the other question, like not just how, but why we do it. Because we don't want to be held personally liable. We don't want to be held liable at all if we can, but also we don't make it easy for, say, an employee lawyer or employee advocate to make it easy for us to be on the front of the Courier Mail or Brisbane Times or whatever it might be. That's one of the fundamentals, is that, yes, you have to deal with all these problems, but also have an understanding of, well, what can we learn from those mistakes, or what we could have done better as well.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from that. And it is, the question was, I didn't want it to be that nuanced or generic, but I think it has to be, because it depends on the organization that you're going to, what the leadership there thinks of the HR function. If the HR function is valued to the necessary degree to make sure that you're not potentially placing your organization or yourself in legal jeopardy, I would suggest to you, and I'm only looking at this as a layperson because I make absolutely no claims about any legal background here, because I've never had to endure a legal issue on either side of that fence, and it's not something I would be looking forward to if it did happen. But I guess it's about how you manage risk in the business, particularly when it comes to your people, because if you're not, as an example, if you're not providing training to your managers that are dealing with people on a day-to-day basis, and you're running some big risks there. And I guess it comes down to this idea, and I didn't think we would go here, but I guess we need to, is the culture of the place. So if there's a culture that says your people are valuable, if not the most valuable asset in the business, then I think the thinking is a little bit different to the people are just one element of how the business operates. Now, I'm not going to make a judgment. Some businesses will go one way, some will go the other, or some hybrid of the two. It sets yourself up for what's your risk profile if something goes to poo, so to speak. I guess one example I could draw out, and I'll get your feedback on this, because I've done some podcasting with some very, very interesting people that have done a deep dive into toxic workplaces and workplace bullying. And I know that that's an area that you have some expertise in. So help me, if you can, define what bullying is in the workplace context, and what you think the level of impact that has on an organization once a bullying incident has been, when you're entering into that litigation space?
There's sometimes a bit of a misconception about workplace bullying, but there's a couple of key characteristics. So it needs to create a health and safety risk, and it has to be repeated and unreasonable behavior. Okay, so that's probably the three main elements to workplace bullying. Recently, the Fair Work Act has actually provided a direct line of complaint for workplace bullying where you can actually make an application. An employee can make an application, but there's no financial benefit to the application. So they've got some ranging powers such as stop bullying orders, which means they can make it public, they can force training. There's a few things that the commission can do, but there's no financial benefit. And that's probably why I don't see a lot of those types of claims. And it gets utilized into other claims such as joint protections, or if it's, that's probably the main one, maybe discrimination or something like that. One, organizations dealing with bullying, it's actually not that relatively easy. Okay, so a lot of people just say, well, there's a complaint of bullying, we're just going to deal with it, we'll believe one side or the other, and we'll go from there. And that's fine, but actually you do need that, and it's conceptually fine, but there's actually more to it. Now, if you've got a policy, follow that. But even if there's no policy, or if there is one, there's pretty much a general process you need to go through. And that really centers upon most likely an investigation of some type. And really what you're doing is trying to get both sides of the story, okay? And there might be extenuating circumstances, and there might even be a clash of facts, right? The facts are not straightforward. You might have to talk to witnesses, and then after all that, come up with what we call a decision on the balance of probabilities, which is basically on the balance, which way do we think we lean on? And it might even be that some's unsubstantiated and some is substantiated. And then from there, then there's a different conversation, probably needs to occur. And then, of course, whatever disciplinary action might occur. But throughout that whole process, there's actually many ways for organization, and many ways organizations have fall into the trap of making mistakes. A really simple one is just taking the word of the complainant for granted. So just saying, okay, yep, we believe you, and then taking immediate disciplinary action. Because what happens is then you're only relying upon that. That is that the complaint is true. If the complaint is not true, right, and that really the facts will probably only be borne out, if you do it that way, will only be borne out in a court, which is, again, not great. You don't want to see that, okay? You don't want to have your dirty laundry aired necessarily in that fashion, especially if you don't know what the people are going to say, right? The witnesses are going to say. You will have a decision, but it may not be to your liking. And it may be that the court says, well, it isn't workplace bullying. The only way it can go is that there is an unfair dismissal, or there's discrimination, or whatever the case of the employee is made. Okay, so that's one way. Another way is dealing with any other complaints that come out of it. So there might be counter complaints, there might be extenuating circumstances, like, for example, that the person didn't actually think that they were actually bullying. There might be extenuating circumstances of family. There might be some family issues in the background. That's why it's coming out in a certain way. And you won't find that information unless you actually investigate it. And that's where a lot of organizations, especially I would have to say smaller businesses, those who don't have a huge HR budget or no HR budget at all, they really get unstuck with that type of situation. As well as, I would say, managers in large organizations who potentially don't have either the capability or the experience to deal with these types of issues in the right way, or at least in a way that can be documented and process and go through a process.
Sounds like it can get exceptionally complicated. So again, you've been around your industry for a fair while. So do you have some sense of the economic impact of poor HR practices leading to litigation, the need to approach your firm and firms like yours on a state or national basis? Do you have some numbers you could throw at us?
I'll put simply, Quarry University, they dealt with a situation where there was quite a few problems. There was harassment, there was bullying, there was an organisation that didn't follow their own policy, there was witnesses that weren't credible. Okay, so there's a lot of issues in there. that employee that filed that claim was awarded $1.3 million. You've got situations where organizations have made mistakes. Okay, in that one, repeated mistakes, sure. But even organizations where they've made even trivial errors such as the employee has been caught stealing, but not given an opportunity to respond to the allegation and was fired immediately. And you think on the face of it, well, that all makes sense. But what if you're wrong? What if there are extenuating circumstances? What if the CCTV footage you're relying upon is grainy and not look that credible anymore? What if they're, what if? And if any of those things come back as, well, there's a problem here, then again, you're relying upon something that you dismiss them on, which may not be true, and therefore has to be an unfair dismissal. So a valid reason and, is not the only thing you're looking for. You're also looking for procedural fairness and natural justice. Okay. And there's different elements to everything, but generally speaking, procedural fairness and natural justice essentially talks about, giving the person an opportunity to respond, following your policies and processes, potentially having a support person in place, being reasonable. If you sort of do those things, generally, a lot of the elements sort of in most things come to play. Yes, there's a few technical legal ones, such as general protections, which has a reverse onus of proof, and even discrimination. But generally, procedural fairness and natural justice will give you generally something to work with. But not all cases or not all issues are the same. And so this is where HR teams, managers and leaders need to be really careful, is they're not just saying, okay, square hole round peg. They need to be very, very careful that it may not fit. And so the best way to do it is to get as much information as possible. If needed, slow down the process if needed. And then, of course, after that, some learnings that come out of that. And the best way to do that, training, reviews of your policies and processes. And so people have especially management teams, have a particular understanding of why things like performance management is integral to a lot of the things that happen with people management.
I think it's worth having these discussions because this is an area when you're talking about leadership where if leadership goes wrong, the consequences are people like yourself will become involved and have to go through where the process has gone wrong. And I think, again, not knowing a lot about how the legal profession works, processes and systems seem to be critical when you're trying to unpack where did it go wrong. And if someone has given a person accused of an issue every chance to demonstrate what happened, give them the time to think about all the things that you talked about, it's a lot more difficult to say this person wasn't given every chance to stump up and say what they'd done or what they hadn't done. My question out of this, out of the millions that are sort of coming to my head at the moment, we don't have the time to go through all of them, obviously. And like I've said before, I'm a curious fellow when it comes to these conversations is, do you see that there's a capacity issue between the bigger end of town and your smaller businesses? And why I ask this is, and I can intuitively, I guess, I think I know where you're going to go with the answer on this, but I'll nuance the question a little by asking and getting your feedback on this question. And an additional one is there a difference, do you think, between size of business, one, and then two, we seem to be encouraged in this country, like many Western countries, to get into small businesses and build a team and build a business. Is there enough in the training when you develop a business that gets it in your head that the people element, there are legal obligations that you've got that you need to adhere to? Is that enough? Is there enough of that education for small business owners, or is that something that is learnt once the proverbial hits the fan?
The answer is probably not. And there is a difference. Naturally is. One, there is more resources. Okay? Naturally, there's more resources. So that's one part of it. The other part as well is that when you're a small business, especially if you're starting out in the startup phase, and it depends on what type of industry you're in. I mean, technology is potentially a little bit different. Pretty much everyone else, especially for service providers, but service providers in particular, you're focused on getting a new contract, revenue generation. That's really the focus, because all those other things, IT, marketing, legal, HR, they won't matter if you don't have the revenue, right? So that's one part, okay? That's definitely right. But yes, there are some problems in that startup, especially if they're hiring people for the first time and they might make some mistakes, and especially if they haven't done it before. Yeah, okay, discrimination claims and some silly things here and there, not paying them correctly. Okay, that happens. Where we see a lot of the problems are the ones where they've gone through rapid growth in a short period of time. So I'm talking about those organizations that have received, new grant money or new funding. They've obtained a government tender, or they've obtained a big corporate tender for the first time. And, maybe they've come up with an idea of how they were going to scope that. And maybe there's some errors there. Okay. So that's one part where they're hiring new people to sort of fill gaps that they didn't know they necessarily had, or they projected they were going to have, but they didn't know the market necessarily with what they were hiring. And because of that, you do have problems. So one is obviously personality clashes like that. That happens all the time. It naturally happens. But the other thing as well is because they don't necessarily have that pure direction of where they're going, necessarily, at least at that stage, they don't have the back end supporting it. So policy and process are a big one, even just missing employment contracts or having contracts that are drafted incorrectly or poorly, protections over confidential information, intellectual property, they're all problematic. Even just use of company assets, such as computers and stuff like that. So because of that, you're not really setting the standards. Yeah. What's acceptable and not acceptable. And then to say to someone, well, that's not acceptable behavior, and then the employer says, well, that's common sense. You should know that. Simply the employee goes, well, I didn't know. Common sense is not what it used to be known as. It's, to be honest, it doesn't really exist. Different people have different standards. And so if you haven't set that out, the code of conduct or something like that, well, yeah, people may misbehave, but only from your perspective, not necessarily from theirs. How they talk to clients and all those types of things. So that's where we see problems, is that those organizations that are going through rapid growth, they might have got a huge tender or something like that, but they haven't done the back end to support that. The HR policy processes and systems, and just even having building capability managers to actually deal with problems, etc.
In the wish list of hiring, you hope that the people that you're hiring have got those skill sets that you're talking about when you get them in. And I think one thing that you're bringing out quite clearly in my thinking is that hiring process, to getting the right people in. If you are in that growth phase, that's kind of your insurance policy, that you're kind of hoping that if you're recruiting in the right way and you're getting middle to senior managers, I would think your expectation is that you're getting people that have got this experience and understand that they have to have good processes, they have to have standard setting, they have to have policies in place. Because this idea to say, well, isn't it common sense? I don't think you can legislate. Can never legislate for common sense. And I used to, back when I was starting at university, I worked with my father in the construction industry, and I used to always gripe about every site you'd go to, you'd have to go through a new induction process, or they'd walk you through what the site was about. And I had it in my head for decades. It's only really now that I've got some friends who are in the OH&S game that are quite more knowledgeable than myself, that said, you do realize at every site you were working at, you're in a dangerous place to be and work, and they're all a little different, and they have to make sure that they're covering off by telling you, I don't care where you've worked before, this site will be different. And I used to think, horseshit, if I have to be safe and work safe, I know what working safe for me means. But and I get it now, as I've got a few more years under my belt. But when I was younger, I just thought it was just painful to have another ticket or another induction, another part of my day lost, just sitting there listening to older people telling me what I can't do, knowing that I'm smart enough to know you don't put electrical gear near water, you don't not wear your helmet, you don't throw things off heights and hope it doesn't hit someone in the head. Like, just simple common sense things. I don't think of that common sense. Some people have to be told, don't throw shit off heights because it could hit someone and kill them and or cripple them. And anyway, look, again, rabbit hole time there. So, all right, Jonathan, I have to ask, I guess, given that I've got you here and I don't want to waste the opportunity in doing this, if I put you in the role of some kind of government ministerial role and you were going to change the face of how small businesses and businesses work in this area, what nuggets of advice would you give to businesses to try and look at how do you protect yourself as best you can and future-proof yourself from these things from happening. Not that I'm saying it will never happen, but how do you inculcate better practice when it comes to HR, employment law, the areas that you work with day in and day out?
So protection is one part, Eric, right? So yes, protect the organization, your business from, nefarious claims. Okay, that's true. That's one part of it. I think the other part as well that businesses sometimes forget is that yes, there's protection and yes, there's a cost to all that, but also it is setting a foundation for further growth as well. Okay, so yes, it sounds like having these contracts, having these policies reviewed and develop them in the right way, paying a lawyer to do that, making sure that these, you manage your team are getting training around having to manage staff. It does sound like a cost, and of course it is. It is a cost, but it is also a foundation for growth. Because even putting aside that as well, there are times when you're tendering for certain organisations out there who require this to be in place, so they can comply with modern slavery legislation, for example, or even just the general, policies around harassment, etc. So you might even you'd be forced into this. But what I would say is before you get forced into something like that, actually sit down, have a think about how you can, yes, one, protect the business, but two, set some of these foundations in place for future growth. And do it at a time when, things are, quiet, all that. Okay, sure. But do it in the background. It doesn't have to be the focus, right? So you might go, okay, Jonathan and NB Lawyers team, guys, can I get you guys to review the contracts? No real rush, but if we can get it done by, say, 1 July, because we have our reviews coming up, we can issue the new contracts as part of that review. Brilliant. You've taken one step, which really could, change, especially if you've got really bad restraint clauses and all those types of things. That can make a big change in the organisation going forward, especially if you're looking to hire more staff, especially if you're looking to restructure a little bit. Those types of things make a huge difference in those rapid growth phases in particular.
Makes a lot of sense if you're starting a small business and you wanting to hire people, setting these things up as templates, as policies that you can build your HR function, even if you don't have the resources to make it a critical part of the business. It is, I think, part of the DNA these days is what I'm seeing in the seafood industry. And I'll just a slight aside here is that I work for a board, and the board has to have professional indemnity insurance every year. You can correct me on this if I'm right. I don't think they have to have it, but they've had it every year since there's been a board, and that protects you on certain things. And the cost of that is going up and up every year. It's not getting any cheaper to do. And when I reached out to a few people that were in the know and asked why, it was because the country is becoming more litigious and there's just more legal activity. And that got me thinking that there's more and more stuff ups around how boards do their thing, because they're not complying to good governance processes. So if you took that thinking and applied it to the world of work in HR in the area where you make your living, part of the DNA of setting something up is to maybe look at these things to try and probably future-proof is the best way to say this in my mind, as much to the extent that you can, because sometimes problems will happen. I could recruit you, Jonathan. I think you're the best. Let's say you weren't a lawyer, you worked in some other specialist area. Hey, I've recruited Jonathan. He's awesome. And then suddenly a year in, you're one of the most toxic managers the place has ever seen. I don't know about it because there's a few degrees of separation. And then suddenly I've got claims coming out of my backside from people going, he doesn't trust us. He's making it hard to work here. We're getting bullied. We're getting repeated inappropriate email content, whatever that is.
Yes.
I'm thinking, how did this happen? And sometimes those people, the narcissists and the sociopaths can get into jobs and then it becomes an issue. I don't think you can escape that. Before we go, can I get you to give the listeners a bit of an overview of what it is that your practice does and how you could help in this area?
Before I do that, Eric, I was going to say, it's really easy to firefight, deal with the problems, react to them. We're getting sued. Let's defend the claim. Really easy. And what I say by that is it is difficult to deal with, but in terms of understanding the psychology of it is actually quite easy. And yes, it's complex, but to be honest, it's much easier to stay in that zone. What's harder is to go back a couple of steps and go into that advisory space where you're trying to advise before it becomes an actual claim. And then going back even further, where you're trying to educate yourself to get to the point where you can identify it before it becomes an issue. So you can head off and have strategies to deal with it. As for example, instead of having a workplace bullying complaint, you've actually got strategies where you're having, regular training. And because you're having regular training with staff and managers, they're able to identify it much quicker, much easier, and much stronger pace, so you can deal with it and have those strategic discussions with those employees who you're dealing with. So if you can get into that space, into the education phase, as opposed to firefighting, I think that's where organized, and it's very hard for small businesses. I get that, very hard. But if you can get to that space earlier, the earlier you can get, the much better it is.
Yeah, but to be fair to you, mate, and I know you always put the qualifier, it's harder for smaller businesses. I think we're all adults here. If you're getting into the space where you're hiring people, the excuse that you're a small business won't cut in court.
No, it doesn't.
If I went to court and I said, look, Your Honor, I'm a small business, I didn't know, ignorance of your responsibilities is not a defense for anything, is it? No. So
there are some protections like small business dismissal code and things like that, but ignorance is not a defense.
Yeah, no, I agree. And why this sets alarm bells off in my head is that the majority of our businesses in this country, like most developed countries, is small to medium businesses. And so the fact that you're saying, as some of those get into growth phases where they find their problems, getting that culture to change and go, well, we need businesses like yours, Jonathan, to help us, to educate us. And so that thing about having a bit of medicine before, pre-prepping yourself and maybe medicines are not the right term here, maybe taking your vitamins and living healthy will ward off the shit that you don't want to happen to you. With legal issues, there's costs involved. Nobody really wins out of the process. I think there's damage all around because it costs somebody money, it costs somebody time, there's reputational impacts. And if leaders don't believe that people don't talk about what's happening internally in your business in quiet halls somewhere, you're crazy. That the culture that you generate will get talked about outside of your business, whether you're aware of that or not. And this gets interesting when you've got, for example, consultants or people that hire people not as employees, but as smaller consultancies that make up the bigger business. Then there's all sorts of issues around that as well, that irrespective whether the person's an employer and a consultant, you've got to have systems and processes in place, because essentially if you're paying for someone to provide you a service that's going to grow your business, then you owe responsibilities and duties of care. Now, we won't go into the defining what those are, but you can't escape by saying, well, you're an independent contractor, so you just got to look after yourself. It's got nothing to do with me.
Yes.
Don't think that flies. And I think intuitively it would make sense that if you're going to take other people on in professional capacities to help you grow your business, then you owe them all sorts of protections and ways to work with them that keeps them happy in the workspace as much as you can physically do that. And like I said, I think it would be silly to think that these things won't happen through the best of protections. But if you do nothing, that's not a strategy either. Doing nothing and hoping something doesn't go wrong that's not good strategy. I've never claimed I'm a strategy expert, but I know that's not a good strategy to do nothing.
Well, doing nothing you have no defense then, right? So if you do nothing, you don't have anything in place. You take action on emotion, you do make emotional reactions and you don't think about it logically. Well, yes, you might get away with it. The early people might say, I don't bother suing. At some point, that luck runs out. And relying upon luck in business is not a strategy. You can get lucky and create your own luck, sure. But just relying upon luck as a strategy in itself, yes, you're going to be caught out. Yes, you're going to have yourself sued and your house problematic. Yes, you're going to lose your savings. Yeah, the answer is yes. Those things will happen. Absolutely. So there's a point of people going, well, should I go into business? Yeah, you need to think about those things. It's not just about revenue generation. That is one part of it. How do I make this into something that I can live off or more, right? Yes, that's one part of it. But there are other parts to it as well. Now, there's many parts, but the people management side, that's quite, especially if you're in a labor-intensive industry where, in particular or an industry where you highly rely upon the production of people to create something, a service or a product. What you do around that people strategy or people management strategy will have a great effect long term. And again, as I said, you might get away with it for a bit of time, for a period of time, but at some point it will come to a head. And I'm talking about family businesses as well. Those family businesses, people, that there's going to come a time where you hire new people, where you hire someone outside the family, where you hire people that you don't necessarily know all that well, that you're taking a punt on. And that's when, problems do occur. Problems do shape up. They're always there, but they do get magnified once that occurs, yes.
Yeah, thank you for throwing in the family business model too. It's I've spoken to a few people in leadership roles that have either expanded on a family business or have moved away from the family business model, and I think that creates a whole nother set of issues, because when you're dealing with your core people being your own family, then that can lead to all sorts of interesting outcomes if those relationships aren't managed properly.
Yeah.
You're talking world of work versus family, and to me personally sounds like a nightmarish thing to be working with. Like, I love my family, but having them run a business with me, that's not a recipe for success. I'm only talking myself here. That to me, the model, the business model, and where I'm going with this, not that I'm undermining family businesses, they're all very good. I'm not having a go at those running family businesses. That just creates a different set of issues, I think, to a business.
Yeah.
That's not the case. So that's all I meant. Come at me when you're listening to the podcast. I'm not anti the family business. I think it's great. It's a pillar of our economy, but it's one of the models that we've got to consider. So, Jonathan, mate, I appreciate your time. So again, before I go, give us a bit of a rundown as to what services you provide and how you can help businesses in this space.
Yeah, so I had the employment law team at NB Lawyers, with the Lawyers for Employers. We can be found at lawyersforemployers.com.au. Phone number is 07 3876 5111. Yes, we have a range of services, but as I said, it's really on those three pillars: education, advice, and of course, the back end, the problem solving, right? So the litigious parts. In particular, we help HR teams and really to assist businesses in, making sure that they can work towards their goals, but we can help with the people management side in particular.
Jonathan, thank you for that. In addition to your plug there, which I appreciate, and for those listening, if you do need help in this area, please reach out to Jonathan and the team. I'll also put your details in the podcast description, and of course a link to your LinkedIn profile, mate. Thank you again.
No worries. Thank you so much.
For those listening, this has been Talking Leadership. Thank you for following the podcast, and we'll catch everyone on the next podcast.